When it comes to creating a video game, it's totally normal for things to change during the development period. Ideas that seemed great on paper might not work very well in practice, and so it isn't unheard of for studios to make tweaks to the formula here and there as launch day approaches. However, there are some games out there that started out life as something entirely different to what they ended up becoming. Naturally, it's hard to define exactly how much change constitutes a drastic change, but we've applied common sense and come up with a bunch of games that we think would have been entirely different had the developers stuck with their original, or in some cases, their second, third, or even fourth visions. We think that in most cases, these changes worked out for the best. Though, for some of them, we can't help but wonder what might have been if they'd stuck to their original path. I'm Ashton from Triple Jump, and here are 10 games that completely changed direction during development. Number 10, Super Mario Bros. 2. We're kicking off proceedings with a rather well-known case of a studio creating one thing and then changing its mind and starting again. When the original Super Mario Bros. Was released for the NES in 1985, it went down very well with players. So well, in fact, that a sequel was deemed necessary. And so, in 1986, Nintendo released Super Mario Bros. 2 in Japan, which was effectively an adaptation of the original that was crazy hard. Meanwhile, the Western video game market was still suffering the effects of the crash of '83, and studio execs were keen not to release anything that would put returning gamers off of buying a title. Nintendo of America took one look at Super Mario Bros. 2, and were reticent to release it in the US due to the fact that an American audience was unlikely to respond well to its high level of difficulty and similarity to its predecessor. Fortunately, Kensuke Tanabe and Shigeru Miyamoto had been hard at work on the side-scrolling platformer Yumi Kojo Doki Doki Panic. At the request of the then Nintendo of America president Minoru Arakawa, Doki Doki Panic was reskinned and released in North America as Super Mario Bros. 2, with the original later getting a Western release as Super Mario Bros. The Lost Levels. Number 9, Borderlands. These days, the Borderlands series is best known for two things: having one of the most fantastic villains in gaming history in Handsome Jack, and for its uniquely comic book-like graphics. Did you know, though, that for much of the first game's development, it looked more like Fallout 3 than it did the Borderlands we know today? Originally, the first game in the series had been developed with traditional graphics and a murky brown muted colour palette, which was at odds with the game's fantastical themes. With 75% of the game completed and a release window to hit, Gearbox had some tough decisions to make. Chief Creative Officer Brian Martell assembled a small team, and they set out to find their purple cow, i.e. something that would make Borderlands stand out from its competitors. They created a prototype of the game with an art style similar to cell shading, pitched it to the team, and, well, the rest is history. Sadly, not everyone was happy with the change, and the game's original art director left the company and the games industry after her work was scrapped. Obviously, it sucked for her, but without the new art style, we can't help but feel like Borderlands wouldn't have become what it is today. Number 8, Conker's Bad Fur Day. If there's one thing you can say about Rare's 2001 platformer, Conker's Bad Fur Day, it's that it is most certainly not suitable for children. It's for that reason that it might surprise you to learn that the game started out as exactly that, a wholesome title that was fun for all of the family. After Super Mario 64 proved to be a hit, Rare got to work on their own 3D platformers, Banjo-Kazooie and Conker's Quest. Both were announced at E3 1997 and got a decent reception from those in attendance, though some journalists found it difficult to tell the two apart. Conker's Quest later showed up at E3 1998, but with a new title, 12 Tales Conker 64. But whilst the reaction was good, behind the scenes, things weren't going so well. The team at Rare were fighting amongst themselves, and the market had become saturated with Mario 64 clones. A new direction was needed, and it was artist Chris Seaver who came up with the idea for an edgy tale in which Conker caused more problems than he solved. The pitch was a hit, the game was retooled into Conker's Bad Fur Day, and it was finally released in 2001 to critical acclaim. I guess sometimes toilet humour is big and clever after all. Number 7, Metroid Prime. The problem with creating a really good game is that you leave yourself in something of a pickle when it comes to a follow-up, as the pressure is really on to come up with something that's as good as, if not better, than its predecessor. This is exactly the problem that Nintendo had after the release of Super Metroid, as no one could conceive a good enough premise for a sequel. Luckily, a brilliant idea of Shigeru Miyamoto's paved the way for Metroid Prime. In 1998, Retro Studios was founded as an alliance between Nintendo and video game industry veteran Jeff Spangenberg, and they immediately got to work on a series of projects for the GameCube. There was vehicular combat title Car Combat, NFL Sim NFL Retro, RPG Raven's Blade, and action-adventure Metaforce. Put simply, Nintendo execs were not impressed by the games, but a visit to the studio from Shigeru Miyamoto breathed new life into one of them. He saw potential in the Metaforce game engine, and suggested it be used to develop a new Metroid title. Ultimately, all 3 of the other games were cancelled, and Retro began focusing squarely on Metroid Prime. This decision definitely worked in everyone's favour though, as Prime went on to become one of the best reviewed Metroid games of all time. Number 6. Grand Theft Auto. If you asked most Grand Theft Auto fans what the best thing about the game is, I should imagine that a good chunk of them will say all the crimes you can commit. What's interesting though, is that if it hadn't been for a change of direction during the development of the first game, players would have been enforcing the law rather than breaking it. Work on Grand Theft Auto began in 1995, though at the time it was called Race and Chase. This iteration saw players controlling a police officer pursuing criminals, but according to Gary Penn, who was at the time the creative director of developer DMA Design, Race and Chase had a number of problems. The main issue though, was that it was about as much fun as watching paint dry. As such, the cops and robbers premise was abandoned, and the developer pressed on with Grand Theft Auto. Despite the new direction, things weren't plain sailing for the studio. A great deal of the core gameplay was fundamentally broken, and the devs had to constantly fight for the game not to be canned. They got there in the end though, and despite some controversy, Grand Theft Auto ended up being both a critical and commercial success. Number 5. Devil May Cry. We've talked about Devil May Cry's origins on this channel before, but it still astounds us that, if not for its premise being so gosh darned cool, the franchise might never have been born. Devil May Cry actually started out as the very first incarnation of Resident Evil 4. At the request of Shinji Mikami, Hideki Kamiya started work on a new entry in the Resident Evil series. Noboru Sugimura, who had written for Resident Evil in the past, was drafted in and created a scenario that was based on Kamiya's vision for a cooler, more stylized action-adventure title. The premise revolved around protagonist Tony, a man with superhuman powers and intellect, and the mystery surrounding his abilities. The team also decided to drop the fixed camera and spent 11 days in Europe photographing Gothic statues, buildings and brickwork to use as textures. Sadly, the cool vibe of this game didn't fit in the world of Resident Evil, but rather than scrapping the project entirely, Mikami was able to convince the team to make it an independent game instead. Kamiya rewrote the story inspired by the Divine Comedy, and thus Devil May Cry came into being. Anyway, speaking of Resident Evil 4, number 4, Resident Evil 4. We've mentioned that the initial idea for Resident Evil 4 was far too cool to fit the franchise, but it wasn't the only Resi 4 alternative that was floated before Capcom finally settled on the Las Plagas plot. When the development of the game restarted in 2001 following the release of Devil May Cry, the team at Capcom got to work on what is now known as the FOG version of the game, which would have seen Leon S. Kennedy infiltrating Umbrella's main headquarters in Europe and becoming infected with the progenitor virus. However, by the time E3 2003 rolled around, the devs had scrapped the FOG version, and audiences were shown the Hookman version, which took place in a haunted house and saw Leon fighting off various paranormal entities. Again though, this didn't end up making the final cut. The penultimate iteration, known as the hallucination version, would have seen Leon heading into the Spencer Mansion to try and seek the truth behind the T-virus outbreak. The project quickly racked up costs and various issues to the point that Shinji Mikami himself had to step in to cancel it. From there, the decision was taken to reinvent the series, and Mikami took over directorial duties and started pushing forward with the Resident Evil 4 we now know. Number 3, Metal Gear Solid 2, Sons of Liberty. There has been a great deal of games released over the years that have disappointed players, but one of the best known is Metal Gear Solid 2, Sons of Liberty. We're not talking disappointing in terms of the overall quality of the game. After all, Metal Gear Solid 2 is without a doubt one of the best games ever made, but rather the initial disappointment players felt at not getting to spend the entire runtime with fan favourite character Solid Snake. According to the man, the myth, the legend, Hideo Kojima, the original plot of Metal Gear Solid 2 would have followed Solid Snake as he attempted to stop the Metal Gear whilst on an aircraft carrier. This was ultimately changed due to rising political tensions in the Middle East, with Kojima and chums feeling they could not, in good conscience, make a game with such a plot. Another reason that Raiden ended up being the game's protagonist rather than Snake was to solve a problem. Kojima felt it would be too difficult to include a tutorial for Snake, as he was, by this point, a veteran soldier, and it wouldn't make much sense on giving him instructions on how to do his job. I, for one, wouldn't want to try to teach Solid Snake how to suck eggs. Number 2. Quake. There aren't many games out there that embody pure shooter action quite like Quake. But did you know that it was originally conceived as an action RPG that drew heavy inspiration from Dungeons & Dragons? Well, now you do. These days, Quake is well known for being one of the finest first-person shooters ever made, alongside the likes of Doom and Wolfenstein 3D. But had id Software continued on their initial trajectory with the title, it would have looked very different indeed. The very first id Software game, Commander Keen in the Invasion of the Vorticons, came with a pack-in preview that advertised a title called The Fight for Justice. Had this ever actually seen release, the game would have focused on the exploits of protagonist Quake. See where this is going yet? The strongest, most dangerous person on the continent, who was armed with thunderbolts and a magical ring of regeneration. Alas, the only thing that survived the fight for justice was the name Quake, though the game didn't immediately hop from RPG to FPS. In fact, in John Romero's mind, Quake was going to be a third-person melee title influenced by Virtua Fighter, but when that was taking too long, it was transformed into what it is today. As a result, Romero left id Software, started his own studio, and released Daikatana. Great! Really glad that had to happen. And number 1, Halo Combat Evolved. It is a widely held belief that Halo Combat Evolved is one of the greatest video games ever made, and it's often credited with modernising the FPS genre. Had things gone a little differently during its development though, it may have instead ended up changing the face of real-time strategy forever. Throughout the 90s, Bungie developed a whole variety of different games, including top-down tank shooters like Operation Desert Storm, first-person shooters such as Marathon and its sequels, and the real-time tactics title, Myth: The Fallen Lords, and Myth 2: Soulblighter. Whilst work was underway for Myth 2, the studio got thinking about its next endeavour, and a group of staffers got to work on a sci-fi RTS title with the name Armour. From there, the game went through a number of changes. Whilst experimenting with ways of controlling units, the devs realised that it was more fun for players to control the vehicles themselves, rather than having AI do it. The title of the game also evolved, changing to Monkey Nuts, then Blam, and cycling through a few others before the studio finally settled on Halo. By the time the game was shown at E3 2000, it was a third-person shooter, and it wasn't until Bungie was acquired by Microsoft that it transformed into an FPS. What a journey.